Part of the responsibility for dealing with that exit poll is the result of the hard work of our election team and Professor Sir John Curtice, of course, who joins us now. John, there is so much to take away from this exit poll so far. Absolutely. What should we be focusing on? What do you believe is the figure or the element that is perhaps the most relevant, important, but also potentially accurate?
OK, the crucial thing, first of all, you need to realise is that this seat forecast is not just simply a consequence of the national shares of the vote that we expect the parties to gain, but rather how they are distributed geographically and how that has moved decisively against the Conservatives. So, for example, support for the Conservatives is falling much more heavily in places where they are trying to defend a seat than it is in places that Labour already hold. But why is that happening? It's not because Labour are doing spectacularly better in Conservative-held seats. It's because Reform are. Much of the damage to the Conservative Party tonight is being done by Reform, even if it is the Labour Party that proves to be the beneficiary. That point two, then, however, the second thing that's making life difficult for the Conservatives is where are Labour doing best? Well, they're doing better in places where they're starting off second to the Conservatives. Oh, and by the way, also places they also seem to be doing quite well in the battle with the SNP, which I'll come back to that. But equally, why is the Liberal Democrat figure so high? It's not because we're anticipating some spectacular rise in Liberal Democrat support, but rather that Ed Davey's hopes of doing particularly well in seats where the Liberal Democrats are the challengers to the Conservatives, it looks as though that hope is going to be realised. So there are two things that flow from that. First, an obvious health warning. While we are pretty convinced that this pattern will exist by the end of the night, whether we've got it exactly right is much more uncertain. Whether we've slightly overestimated or underestimated these patterns could make quite a lot of difference to the seat outcome. The second thing that flows from this is that although this looks like an election in which Labour are going to get a landslide in terms of seats, it does not follow, I will repeat, it does not follow that this necessarily means that Labour have got a landslide in terms of votes. So that's point number one about the broad picture we're presenting this exit poll, the health warning that goes with the estimate, but also the implications for how we might end up interpreting this result at the end of the night. There are then two other things to say. The two figures that I think has probably caused most surprise, most discussion, perhaps most controversy, are one, Reform at 13, and two, the SNP at 10. Those are the two figures about which we are least certain. Basically, what we have got in the exit poll is a lot of places where there is a small chance that Reform will win the seat, but we're talking about 20, 30% chance. And the question, and we add up these probabilities, and that's how we get to the figure of 13. But to be honest, the figure could end up being quite a lot less than that, or indeed rather more, just depending on how the cookie crumbles. I mean, more equally, it's already been emphasising from the beginning of the night, inevitably we have fewer sampling points in Scotland than elsewhere. It does look as though the SNP have done particularly badly. But remember, there are lots of seats in Scotland which are marginal between Labour and the SNP. And we have even if we've just underestimated the SNP's performance relative to Labour by a little bit, then that SNP number will go up. So those are the health warnings. Of course, behind all of this, it does look as though, yep, Sir Keir Starmer is going to be the Prime Minister tomorrow. He's probably going to have a very substantial overall majority. And that, of course, is the crucial thing we're trying to find out. But there is still inevitably plenty of uncertainty in an election, which in many ways looks as though we're going to come up with all sorts of historical records in terms of shares, seats, and also the change in the geography of support. This is, in a sense, is going to be one of the most interesting and unprecedented elections in British psephological history.
It certainly is, John, and you've given us the appropriate bucket of salt to be very careful about these early results, even though, as you've clearly explained, the seat numbers might be very different from those smaller parties. That very significant suggestion that Reform might be on 13 seats, and that equally significant suggestion in the other way that the SNP might crash to 10. You've been very clear that those numbers might change. However, are you telling us tonight that the exit polls suggest that those broad movements of voters, massively up for reform and massively down for the SNP, are there, even if they don't translate into seats?
Yes, and inevitably, well, certainly so far as reform are concerned, we are very confident that they are doing something not a million miles away from what the final opinion polls were estimating in terms of vote share. It's a question of how that translates into seats, and that's much more difficult to estimate. In the case of the SNP, because we have fewer sampling points, it is just possible that we might have underestimated the SNP support. Though that said, we're pretty confident that the Labour Party is going to end up with most seats in Scotland. Is just exactly what is the gap between the two parties is going to prove to be. I thought it was interesting that Angus Robertson, at least on air, didn't seriously dispute our figures. It sounds as though the SNP are willing to accept that they're not going to remain the largest party in Scotland, but of course there's still that still leaves a possibility for the SNP to be, say, at 15 or 18 rather than at 10. Who knows? That's one of the reasons why our viewers should be staying up through the night, because the exit poll gives us a guide, but in the end of the day, it's only the ballot boxes that will tell us the truth.
And I was going to say that. That's exactly why you have to stay up all night with us. But John, a very significant point there. If the SNP does look like it will be the smallest party, that suggests if they don't have a majority in Scotland anymore, that their push for another independence referendum will be significantly harder to make.
Yeah.